Well, good day and a very warm welcome to you all to our Swallowtail conference. My name is Mark Collins. I have the honour to be the founding chairman of the Swallowtail and Birdwing Butterfly Trust, which has organised this. And my thanks go out to Martin and Rob, who've put the technology together to enable us to meet together in this way. So let me begin my talk now. I'll just share my screen with you and start the presentation. So, my talk is about the British swallowtail, which is under threat from sea level rise and invading subspecies, amongst other things. And there's a picture of the swallowtail on the bottom right, spectacularly attractive swallowtail butterfly. Now, before I talk about our own British swallowtail, I'd like to just talk about the species as a whole, Papilio often called the swallowtail, because this was the first swallowtail described by Linnaeus. It is, in fact, the type species for the genus Papilio, which is the biggest genus in the Papilionidae, the swallowtail family, with more than 200 species. Some people will divide them up into subgenera or even raise those subgenera to genus status. But broadly, the genus Papilio is a spectacularly successful genus within the family in which we all have an interest. The species Papilio in fact, has a holarctic distribution. This means that it's found right around the northern hemisphere, across Europe, North America, and Asia. There are 41 subspecies that sort of one takes over from another as you go around the planet. And they all have in common that they feed on umbellifers in the family Apiaceae. This is the carrot and fennel family, which will be well known to you all, common roadside and agricultural plants. So it's not perhaps surprising that this species is not threatened overall as a species, although there are red data book entries for South Korea, Russia, Austria, and the UK. And the species is protected by law in some countries, the UK, for example, Austria, Hungary, India, and indeed elsewhere. There are just two endemic subspecies with very narrow distributions in the UK and Malta. We'll talk about the British one in a moment. In Malta, the subspecies Papilio melitensis is apparently quite common, feeding on fennel and rue, and not known to be under any serious threat. Turning to our own British subspecies, Papilio britannicus, and its natural history, this is Britain's largest butterfly, actually, largest breeding butterfly, and it's much loved by the public, who will travel quite large distances to visit the reed beds in Norfolk, where this butterfly breeds. Generally, it only has a single brood in each year, can occasionally have two, but normally it overwinters as a pupa on the stems of reed and emerges the next year in May and flies through to July. The eggs are laid on milk parsley only, which is toxic to most species. You can see a picture on the right with a spectacularly beautiful caterpillar on the flowers of milk parsley there. The females prefer to find tall emergent plants coming out of the reed bed. These milk parsley plants can be quite tall, up to about 2 meters, and they fly quickly across the reed bed looking for the food plant to lay their eggs on. The conservation status of the swallowtail in Britain is a matter of great concern. There hasn't been a full census of all Britain's butterflies since 2014, reported in 2015. But the situation today is broadly similar for the swallowtail. The UK Butterfly Monitoring Scheme uses transects, a certain length, and people walk along and count the butterflies. In 1976 to 2014, those transects showed that the counts were up by 88%, and indeed up by 30% between 2005 and 2014. You might think from those figures that all was well, but those transects tend to be in protected areas and in some of the strongholds, breeding areas of the swallowtail. If you look in the wider countryside, there are currently only 10 kilometre squares and 78 1 kilometre squares where the swallowtail is found. And those figures are down 56% between 1974 and 2014, and down 13% in 2005 to 2014. So the actual distribution overall of the butterfly has reduced significantly, continues to do so. But it means that where the butterfly is surviving, it's doing well and believed to be stable. But these are only in well-protected sites with the sort of suitable regime for that the butterfly needs. As a result, there are only 17 remaining breeding sites in Britain of this subspecies. So let's look at the threats to the British swallowtail. What are the problems? At one time, the subspecies was widespread in reed beds in Somerset, the Thames Valley, and up into Cambridgeshire and across Norfolk and Suffolk. But today, the distribution is much reduced, and there are four principal reasons for this: loss of habitat, with over 95% of its wetland habitat drained since the 18th century. Secondly, the scarcity of the vulnerable food plant, milk parsley. Thirdly, immigration of Papilliomycaon gorganus from the European mainland. And fourthly, sea level rise caused by climate change, which is destroying reed beds around the outskirts of Great Britain. And we'll look at each of these concerns in turn and conclude with some ideas for the future. So first of all, let's look at the loss of reed beds. In the 17th century, drainage converted large areas of these reed beds to agriculture. They're very good soils for agriculture. They are much prized. In the 20th century, even in the remaining areas, reed cutting declined, and this meant that trees and bushes managed to come in and would overtake the reeds and create woodland, wet woodland. Reed cutting declined because it was no longer needed for bedding for animals, and less of it was used for thatching for houses. Agricultural pollution has also reduced the quality of the remaining existing sites where nutrients from agriculture have come off the land into the wetlands. And on our coastlines, reed beds are being lost due to sea level rise. In fact, there are only about 900 remaining reed beds in the United Kingdom, and only 50 of these are big enough, that's to say 20 hectares or more, to support full communities, such as the bittern and the bearded tit you see a picture of here. So the focus now is on creating more reed beds at inland sites, for example, the Great Fen Project, creating new markets for biofuel and compost to support the reed cutting industry. And over 1,500 hectares of new reed bed have in fact been created. But unfortunately, these new reed beds have no milk parsley and no swallowtails. Let's move on to the milk parsley problem. Milk parsley, as you can see from the map on the right, has a very limited UK distribution. It's not terribly clear perhaps on your screen, but the open dots are pre-1950, the closed dots are post-1950, and indeed the closed dots today are even fewer than shown here. So essentially there is one site left in Somerset, and the rest, milk parsley, are in Norfolk on the east. The species, not surprisingly, is designated vulnerable, which is even more of a serious conservation status than the swallowtail itself. And it's threatened, milk parsley is threatened by drainage and salinization, salty water. It has a complex ecology. It germinates well after reed cutting, but the plants themselves respond badly to reed cutting itself. So once the reeds have been cut, the plants will grow, but if you cut again, the milk parsley will start to disappear. And milk parsley requires wet ground, but not flooded. So often it's found growing on a tussock of sedges and other plants inside the reed beds. Nevertheless, despite these difficulties, milk parsley is actually quite easy to propagate in a horticultural environment, and can indeed be grown up from seed and can be planted out. Here are some of the sort of environments where you find milk parsley. On the left, you see the emergent umbels of the plant, the flowers coming out of the reed bed. In the middle, the fine-toothed leaves of milk parsley. And on the right, is an example of wet woodland, where milk parsley can also be found on the edges, but it's never been known to be suitable for swallowtails and for the breeding of swallowtails. Let's move on to the next problem for swallowtails, which is the migration of this butterfly on the bottom right, Papiliomachion gorganus. Very similar in appearance in the hand, hard to tell the difference, and indeed, as a result, historical records in Britain are a bit unreliable. We're not sure which one they people were seeing back in those days. But gorganus is a much stronger flyer, and it migrates across Europe and over to the United Kingdom, across the English Channel and the North Sea, and occasionally it's been known to breed and even overwinter on the south coast. But its feeding habits are quite different, and it accepts common umbellifers such as angelica, carrot, fennel, and hogweeds, but it does not feed on milk parsley. So although it looks the same as our own subspecies, its ecology is actually completely different. And when you look at the distribution of sightings, this is of sightings, not just breeding, sightings of these two subspecies since 2000. The red dots are sightings of the British Swallowtail, Britannicus. The green ones are gorganus. And you can see how gorganus is a strong flyer and will reach right along the south coast, comes off over to Kent quite frequently, as you can see bottom right. But the British Swallowtail has very limited capacity for flight, only about 30 kilometers actually, and does not spread itself very widely. The sightings, if this was a map of the current day, the sightings of the British Swallowtail would be far fewer than shown on this particular map, and almost entirely up in the top right there, the square labeled TG. Now, the final threat is from sea level rise. Let's talk about this. The UK Climate Change Committee in October 2018 published a report which suggested that up to 1 meter sea level rise is possible, and greater than 50 centimeters highly probable by the end of the current century, possibly even a lot earlier than that. England's coastal defences are vulnerable to failure, and it's unlikely that in all parts of England that those defences would be preserved. Managed realignment, as it's called, is foreseen in many areas where the coastal embankments would be given up, and flooding of the sea into the low-lying areas would be allowed. This is quite likely on the east coast of England, in Norfolk and parts of Suffolk, where there are large low-lying areas that were at one time, in fact, in Roman times, part of the seascape anyway, and it's foreseen that they may return to that once again. This is a picture of the current maps of the main rivers in Norfolk, the River Yare, River Bure, River Thurne, River Ant, and the green areas on this map are the low-lying areas where reed beds and suitable habitat for swallowtail butterflies and milk parsley commonly occur. If you overlay that map, however, with just half a meter of sea level rise, you will see here that the salty water is expected to inundate quite large areas and reach up into the upper reaches of the swallowtail and milk parsley habitat, including Hickling Broad, one of the most famous sites for swallowtails, which would expect to be quite seriously flooded by salty water if this scenario comes about. It may be, we hope, that some of these sites in the upland parts of the rivers may survive and butterflies would continue to breed there. But we don't know whether swallowtails will be able to migrate further eastwards and northwards to take advantage of other reed beds. In fact, if they migrate further into the countryside, as I've mentioned before, there are no reed beds left. They have already been lost. So the swallowtail faces serious contractions in the habitat available to it. Now, could these swallowtails be translocated? It has been tried before, lessons from Wicken Fen. Wicken Fen in Cambridgeshire is more of an inland site, and before 1950, it was a prime site for swallowtails. In 1974-5, milk parsley plants were introduced and 228 swallowtails. You can see them in this cardboard box with the entomologists of the day about to release them. Unfortunately, they were extinct 5 or 6 years later by 1980. Another attempt was made in 1993, but that failed due to drought. It seems likely that swallowtails, the Wicken Fen was too small as a reintroduction site. And the swallowtails do tend to disperse, albeit not very far, but they do disperse. And unless they find other populations in which they can mix in and breed, then they will be lost in the wider countryside. And that seems to be what has happened at Wicken Fen. So lessons need to be learned from this before anything is tried again. However, there are some sites that might be possible reintroduction sites for the swallowtail and milk parsley. Lakenheath Fen, here bottom left, is a former carrot farm, in fact, which has been planted up with reeds. But as yet, there are no milk parsley plants there and certainly no swallowtails. The Great Fen project, the picture on the right, is the biggest project to create in Britain, to create new reed beds and new wetlands, and it is relatively secure from sea level rise. But again, this area has no milk parsley or swallowtails at present. They would have to be introduced. And we don't know perhaps enough about their ecology yet to be sure of success. The only other possible site is Shapwick Marsh in Somerset, where there is a remnant population of milk parsley, and that needs to be looked at as a possibility for the future. So in summary then, the principal threats to the swallowtail butterfly in Britain are habitat loss from drainage of its wetland ecosystem, the rarity of its food plant, milk parsley, which has particular ecological requirements and is a vulnerable plant whose range is also reducing. We have this difficulty of the migrating competitor Papiliomacaon gorganus coming over from the continent as a result of climate warming and getting a bit of a foothold in Britain. But we don't yet know whether they would hybridize with Papiliomacaon britannicus or not. They have not been seen in the Norfolk Broads. They don't feed on milk parsley. So we don't know what will happen when these two subspecies eventually meet up. Translocation should be considered. There are sites such as Lakenheath Fen, the Great Fen in Cambridgeshire, and Shapwick in Somerset are possible sites to consider for the future. But we don't know enough yet about how the ecology of milk parsley and swallowtail work to be sure that if all the investment and work was done to translate these translocate these species to Somerset or the Great Fen, we don't know enough to be sure that would be successful. And much further research is indeed needed on how to create the ideal conditions for milk parsley and the swallowtail. So in short, the swallowtail does face an uncertain future. There is some thinking going on, but more needs to be done to ensure that our very special butterfly, Papiliomacaon britannicus, can survive into the long term. It's been a pleasure speaking with you, and thank you very much for listening and watching. Bye-bye.